the Trojan War. Few events from ancient history stand so tall in legend and memory. A conflict of gods and mortals, of love and betrayal, of glory and tragedy. Somewhere between the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, long before Rome was even a dream, the Greeks set their eyes upon the shining walls of Troy, whether myth, history, or a blend of both. The story of the Trojan War has been told for more than 3,000 years. But before swords clashed and the ships of 1,000 kings landed on Trojan shores, the seeds of war were planted in the most unexpected way through a quarrel among the gods, and the fateful choice of one young prince. The story begins not with kings or warriors, but at a wedding. High upon Mount Olympus, the gods and goddesses gathered to celebrate the marriage of Peleus, a mortal, and Thetis, a sea goddess. Almost every god was invited to the feast, every god, that is, except Eris, the goddess of discord. Offended Eris sought revenge. She tossed a golden apple into the hall, inscribed with 3 fateful words, "For the fairest." Immediately, 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. And none of the gods dared decide between them, for who could choose safely between the most powerful of Olympus? So the task fell to a mortal, Paris, Prince of Troy. Paris was no ordinary man, handsome, thoughtful, and skilled in speech. He was chosen to settle the quarrel. Each goddess tempted him with gifts. Hera promised him power and dominion to be king of the greatest empire on earth. Athena promised him wisdom and victory in battle, eternal glory as the greatest warrior. Aphrodite, with a knowing smile, promised him something different: the love of the most beautiful woman alive. Paris listened, but in the end, it was Aphrodite who won his heart. He handed the apple to her, declaring her the fairest. But this choice was no innocent act. In siding with Aphrodite, Paris had made enemies of Hera and Athena, 2 goddesses whose wrath would echo across the battlefields of Troy. Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the most beautiful woman alive. The prize Aphrodite had promised was Helen of Sparta. Helen was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, said to be so breathtaking that kings from all across Greece had once sought her hand in marriage. To avoid bloodshed, her stepfather, King Tyndareus, had made all the suitors swear an oath. They would respect Helen as choice of husband and defend him against any who tried to take her away. Helen's chosen husband was Menelaus, king of Sparta, brother of the mighty Agamemnon. For a time she was queen of Sparta, living in peace. But Paris, guided by Aphrodite, journeyed to Sparta. Some say Helen was enchanted by the goddess and fell for Paris willingly. Others claim she was stolen against her will, spirited away to Troy. Either way, the result was the same: Helen was gone, and the oath of the Greek kings would soon be tested. When Menelaus discovered his wife had been taken, he was furious. Insult was not only personal, but political. To have Helen stolen was a direct challenge to his honor, his throne, and the oath sworn by every Greek leader. Menelaus turned to his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most powerful ruler in Greece. Together, they began to call upon the former suitors of Helen, the kings, princes, and warriors who had sworn to defend her marriage. One by one, they answered the call. And so, the greatest army Greece had ever seen was assembled. This was no ordinary force. It was a gathering of legends. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, who would lead the campaign. Menelaus, king of Sparta, fighting for his honor and wife. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, clever and cunning, who at first tried to avoid the war by pretending madness. Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, bringing experience and counsel. Achilles, son of the sea goddess Thetis, destined to be the greatest warrior of the age. Ajax the Great, a giant of a man, nearly unstoppable in combat. These and many more dozens of kings and their armies set sail, bound together by oath, ambition, and vengeance. But assembling the army was one thing. Reaching Troy was another. Legend tells that the fleet was delayed by unfavorable winds, for the goddess Artemis had been offended by Agamemnon. To appease her, Agamemnon made a terrible choice. He sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia. Only then did the winds shift, allowing the 1,000 ships to sail toward Troy. While the Greeks prepared for war, Troy awaited. Ouch. Troy was no mere city. Located near the Dardanelles Strait, it controlled vital trade routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Its wealth was legendary, its walls said to be impenetrable. King Priam, ruler of Troy, was a wise and noble leader. His sons were many, but the most famous among them were Hector, a brave warrior and heir to the throne, and Paris, the young prince whose judgment had set these events into motion. The Trojans were not alone. Allies from neighboring regions, Lycians, Thracians, and others would join them in defense of their city. They believed their walls, their gods, and their courage would keep them safe. But the Greeks were coming, and they would not be turned back easily. The fleet of 1,000 ships finally landed on Trojan shores. Warriors poured out, shields and spears gleaming in the sun. The Greeks expected a swift victory, but Troy was ready. For 9 years, the war dragged on. Battles raged across the plains before the city, yet Troy's mighty walls held firm. Heroes clashed: Achilles against Hector, Ajax against the Trojan champions, Odysseus plotting tricks and raids. The gods themselves took sides, descending to the battlefield to aid their favorites. This was no ordinary war. It was a war of destiny. The war between the Achaeans, whom we often call the Greeks, and the Trojans, was not a swift or decisive conflict. It dragged on year after year, becoming a test not just of military strength, but of endurance, cunning, and divine favor. By the time the war had reached its middle years, both sides were exhausted, yet neither willing to yield. The Achaean fleet had set out under the command of King Agamemnon of Mycenae, determined to bring Helen back to her husband Menelaus and to humble the proud city of Troy. But as the seasons passed, the war transformed into something far greater, a clash that shook the ancient world, entangling kings, heroes, and gods alike. The siege begins. At first, the Greeks believed their superior numbers would quickly overwhelm Troy. They laid siege to the mighty city, surrounding its walls and cutting off supplies where they could. Yet Troy's fortifications were legendary, said to have been built by the gods Poseidon and Apollo themselves. The walls stood tall and unbroken, and the Trojans defended them with ferocity. The war soon became a series of raids, skirmishes, and personal duels. Heroes were called to the forefront, for in this age, war was as much about honor as it was about conquest. Each champion sought to carve his name into eternity through acts of bravery. Achilles and Agamemnon, one of the greatest figures among the Achaeans, was Achilles, son of the sea goddess Thetis. Swift of foot and unmatched in battle, Achilles was seen as nearly invincible. But even the strongest of men were bound by pride, and pride would soon threaten the very unity of the Greek army. The quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon is one of the most famous episodes of the war. After a raid on a Trojan-allied city, the Achaeans divided the spoils. Agamemnon, as commander, claimed a maiden named Chryses. When her father, a priest of Apollo, begged for her return, Agamemnon refused. Enraged, Apollo sent a plague upon the Greek camp. To end the suffering, Agamemnon was forced to surrender Chryses. But in anger and humiliation, he took another prized princess from Achilles. Gosh, this insult cut Achilles deeply. Feeling dishonored, he withdrew from the fighting entirely, refusing to lift his spear in defense of the Achaeans. His absence would have devastating consequences. For without Achilles, the Trojans began to push the Greeks back. The wrath of the gods themselves were far from neutral in this war. Each deity chose sides, often swayed by old grudges, promises, or personal whims. Hera and Athena, still bitter over the judgment of Paris, supported the Greeks. Aphrodite, who had promised Paris the love of Helen, stood firmly with the Trojans. Apollo, angered by Agamemnon's insult to his priest, also favored Troy. Poseidon, though a god of the sea, often aided the Greeks, though his loyalties wavered. The battlefield became not just a contest of mortals but of immortals, with gods appearing in disguise, hurling storms, or turning the tide of combat in an instant. For the men on the ground, war was already brutal enough, but the whims of the gods made it a nightmare. Hector, defender of Troy, if Achilles was the champion of the Greeks, then Hector, eldest son of King Priam of Troy, is the champion of the Trojans. Unlike Paris, Hector was a true warrior noble, courageous, and loyal to his people. He knew the dangers of facing the Greeks in open battle, yet he did not shirk his duty. Time and again, Hector led sorties from the gates of Troy, striking fear into the hearts of the Greeks. His very presence on the battlefield inspired the Trojans to stand firm. Yet Hector was not merely a soldier, he was also a husband and father. Legends tell of the tender moment when he returned to the walls of Troy, removing his helmet, so that his infant son would not be frightened. In Hector, we see not just the warrior, but the man who fought because he must, not because he desired glory. The turning point. Patroclus in Achilles' armor, as the years of war dragged on, the Greeks grew desperate. Without Achilles, their morale sank. At last, it was Achilles' closest companion, Patroclus, who sought to rally the men. He begged Achilles to return to battle, but when the great warrior refused, Patroclus asked for his armor instead. Clad in Achilles' shining armor, Patroclus led the Greeks into battle. The Trojans, believing Achilles had returned, faltered in fear. Patroclus fought with valor, driving the Trojans back from the ships. But fate would not spare him. In the heat of battle, Hector himself struck Patroclus down. When news of Patroclus' death reached Achilles, the grief and rage that consumed him were beyond measure. The man who had withdrawn from the war now burned with vengeance. His wrath would change everything. Achilles returned. Achilles returned to battle with a fury that seemed almost divine. He pursued Hector relentlessly, cutting down Trojan warriors in his path. The gods themselves trembled at his rage, and even the river Scamander rose against him, choked with the bodies of the slain. At last, Hector and Achilles faced one another outside the walls of Troy. Hector knew his death was near, yet he stood firm, unwilling to abandon his honor. The duel was fierce, but in the end, Hector fell. In his grief and fury, Achilles desecrated Hector's body, dragging it behind his chariot around the walls of Troy. It was a moment of triumph for the Greeks, but also a moment of deep sorrow for the Trojans. The death of Hector was more than the fall of a warrior, it was the beginning of the end for Troy. The war drags on even with Hector gone. The war did not end immediately. The Trojans still held their city, and the Greeks still faced the seemingly impossible task of breaching Troy's walls. Yet now the balance had shifted. With Achilles back on the field, the Greeks regained their strength. Still, the gods were not finished with their games. Destiny had yet to play its final card, and the war's end would come not through brute force, but through cunning, a trick that would echo through history. The turning tide after Hector's death, with Hector gone, the Trojans felt as if the very heart of their city had been ripped away. Priam, their aged king, wept over his son's broken body, knowing that Troy's greatest defender was no more. Yet, the war did not immediately end with Hector's death. Instead, it entered a new and even bloodier stage. The Greeks, reinvigorated by their greatest warrior Achilles, pushed harder against the walls of Troy, but Troy was not defenseless. The city's walls, said to be built by the gods Poseidon and Apollo, still stood tall and unbroken. And the Trojans still had powerful allies like the Amazon queen Penthesilea, who marched to Troy with her fierce warriors, and Memnon, the Ethiopian king, whose army fought with unmatched bravery. Each new ally gave the Trojans a moment of hope, but each was struck down by Achilles, whose rage seemed unending. The death of Achilles, yet even Achilles, the almost invincible hero, could not escape fate. His mother Thetis had tried to make him immortal by dipping him in the river Styx as a child, but the heel by which she held him remained untouched by the water. That small, vulnerable spot would become legendary as the Achilles heel. The Trojan prince Paris, who had once stolen Helen and set the entire war into motion, finally had his moment. Guided by Apollo, Paris shot a poisoned arrow that found its mark, Achilles' heel. The great warrior fell, his body crashing into the earth like a fallen oak. The Greeks were devastated. Their greatest champion was dead, and his funeral was marked by grief and sacrifice. His armor, crafted by the god Hephaestus himself, became a prize to be awarded to the next greatest hero. Ajax the Great and Odysseus competed for the honor. But when Odysseus was chosen, Ajax was consumed with rage and despair. His mind clouded. He turned his sword upon himself. Two of Greece's greatest heroes, Gone Achilles and Ajaxon, yet the war raged on. Odysseus and the plan of deception the Greeks had fought for nearly 10 years, and still the walls of Troy stood unbroken. Force had failed. Bravery had failed. Even divine aid had failed. It was then that Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, renowned for his cunning, proposed an idea so daring, so unexpected, that it would become one of the most famous tricks in history. The Greeks pretended to give up. They set fire to their camps, boarded their ships, and sailed away, or at least they made it seem so. In their place, they left behind a colossal wooden horse, seemingly as an offering to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. The Trojans poured out of their gates to see the strange object. They debated what to do. Some, like Laocoon, a Trojan priest, warned against it. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he cried. He even hurled a spear into the horse's side, and for a moment the sound of hidden warriors echoed inside. But fate had already chosen its path. That very night, as Laocoon made sacrifices to the gods, 2 giant serpents rose from the sea and strangled him and his sons. To the Trojans, it seemed like a sign from the gods that the horse was sacred. Against all reason, they dragged the massive structure inside their city walls. The night of fire and blood, when night fell and Troy celebrated what they thought was the end of the war, the Greeks struck. From within the horse, Odysseus, Menelaus, and the hidden warriors crept out and opened the gates of Troy. The Greek fleet, which had only been hiding nearby, returned under the cover of darkness. The city that had stood for 10 years, proud and defiant, was caught completely unprepared. Flames engulfed the streets. Warriors cut down men, women, and children alike. Priam, the aged king, was slaughtered at the altar of Zeus. Cassandra, his prophetic daughter, who had long warned of disaster, was dragged away into slavery. Andromache, Hector's widow, saw her infant son Astyanax torn from her arms and thrown from the walls, so that no heir of Troy might rise again. The once mighty city of Troy was reduced to rubble and ash. Its people were either slain or enslaved, its treasures looted, its glory forever ended. Helen's fate, and what of Helen, the woman whose face had launched 1,000 ships? When Menelaus finally found her amidst the ruins, he raised his sword to kill her. But as the story goes, her beauty disarmed him. Some say he forgave her and took her back to Sparta. Others whisper that she betrayed Troy long before its fall, secretly aiding the Greeks. Regardless, Helen survived the war that had been fought over her, though countless others had perished. The aftermath. A cursed victory, though the Greeks had won, their victory came at a terrible cost. Few returned home safely. The gods, angered by their cruelty, punished many of the victors. Agamemnon, the Greek commander, was murdered by his own wife upon returning home. Menelaus and Helen faced storms and wandering before reaching Sparta again. Odysseus, whose cunning had brought about Troy's fall, spent 10 long years lost at sea before reaching Ithaca, facing monsters, temptations, and the wrath of Poseidon. It seemed as if the curse of Troy followed all who had touched its fate. Legacy of the Trojan War. Whether the Trojan War was entirely real or partly myth, its legacy endured for centuries. The Greeks saw it as the ultimate tale of heroism, betrayal, love, and the will of the gods. Homer immortalized it in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Later poets, playwrights, and historians retold its stories in countless forms. The fall of Troy symbolized the fragility of even the mightiest cities, the consequences of pride, and the unpredictable nature of fate. It became not just a story of war, but a reflection on human nature itself, the lust for power, the fury of revenge, the pain of loss, and the hope of legacy. And so the tale of the Trojan War did not end with Troy's ashes. It lived on, whispered through the ages, shaping the way the ancient world remembered heroism, tragedy, and destiny.